Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Basak Kus, an Assistant Professor of Sociology at Wesleyan University. She's here at Yale as a visiting faculty fellow at the Council on Middle East Studies at the MacMillan Center. Her research interests include inequality, finance and society, regulatory politics, and economic crises and reforms. She also writes about Turkish political economy. Today we'll talk with Professor Kus about her work on financialization, credit, and income inequality. Welcome, Professor Kus.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Let's start with income inequality. What kind of work have you done around that topic?
Sure. My work attempts to understand the ways in which financialization of advanced economies over the past few decades mattered for income inequality and for the larger politics of inequality. Before going into further detail, it might be helpful to give a bit of perspective about the recent trends on income inequality.
Sure.
Over the past few decades, income inequality has been on the rise in most OECD nations. In many of these nations, folks in the top 10% and top 1% have benefited greatly from economic growth, and they've been taking the lion's share of total income. For folks at the lower end of income distribution, it's a different story, right? A recent OECD report, for instance, shows that 40% of the population at the lower end of the income distribution benefited very little from economic growth, if at all. In some nations, actually, this group has seen their incomes fall in real terms. I think this is why we are seeing so much public concern over growing income inequality, especially since the 2008 economic crisis. And I think this is why this issue has been very salient to the recent presidential campaigns.
Exactly. Everyone's talking about that 1%.
Exactly. Absolutely. So to come back to your question, I'm very interested in understanding the causes of rising income inequality, but I also am very interested in understanding why governments and individuals respond to it the way they do. And in various papers I've written in the past few years, I've been trying to make the case that in order to engage with the contemporary politics of inequality, in order to make sense of both the rising income inequality and government's response to it, we really have to put it in the context of this significant structural transformation that has taken place in advanced economies, and that is financialization.
Okay, and what do you mean by that term?
Sure. So we're talking about the growing size and presence of financial institutions, financial transaction and activities in the overall economy, but also in the everyday life of citizens. Let me be a bit more specific than that.
Great.
So the size of the financial sector has been increasing in advanced nations over the past few decades. In the United States, since the early 1980s, there has been a steady shift from manufacturing towards finance-oriented activities. For instance, sociologist Greta Krippner shows us that the share of the financial sector in total corporate profits was around 10-15% in the 1950s and 60s. In the 1980s, it had increased to 20%. By the end of the 1990s, it was over 40%. The contribution of the financial sector to GDP more than doubled from the early 1980s to mid-2000s. So that's one aspect of it, but that's not all. In the same period, we also saw that non-financial corporations began to rely on financial sector and financial investments as their source of income and profit.
Okay.
We saw even quintessential industrial firms like General Electric set up and manage banking operations. By 2001, for instance, that's the year when Jack Welch's tenure ended at General Electric, GE was making more than half of its revenue and more than 1/3 of its profits from the finance operations. And as these things were happening, another important development that took place was that a new corporate governance style emerged in the United States. Finance-oriented managers began to manage major corporations, and financialization rewarded them by increasing their stock prices, and increasing the stock prices actually became their primary motive rather than focusing on long-term market share, productivity, innovation. They really began to pay a lot of attention to short-term financial payoffs. So that was another sort of important part of the developments that we sort of describe under the rubric of financialization. And finally, finance penetrated into the everyday life of citizens, right? Citizens began to spend in financial markets, invest in financial markets. They began to borrow from financial markets. They actually became really reliant on financial markets for their socioeconomic stability. So for instance, the share of stocks in the total sort of assets of American households more than doubled from the early 1980s to the end of the 1990s. Again, from the early 1990s, these are numbers that I can remember from the top of my mind, up until the crisis. In that sort of 2 decades of period, Americans' use of credit increased tremendously. So these are the transformations that we're talking about when we talk about financialization. And now there's really interesting work looking at the ways in which these sort of mechanisms, these developments mattered for income inequality. So for instance, as I said, the size of the financial sector expanded.
Right.
And it happened at the expense of the non-financial sector. As the profitability of the non-financial sector declined, there is increasing consensus among scholars that it impacted the paychecks of the many working class and middle class folks operating in those non-financial sectors. Similarly, as this new corporate governance style emerged, CEOs running these companies found incentive to cut labor costs, and they were rewarded when they made those hard decisions. Another mechanism that seems to have mattered a lot is that we find that financial asset ownership is really concentrated at the top of the wealth distribution. And as we know, income from capital is higher for larger investments. So individuals, high income, high net worth individuals were able to gain a lot of income from their capital through investing in financial markets. And that capital did not remain subject to the form of taxation that other forms of income are typically subject to. Another mechanism that seems to have mattered is that governments, as they were trying to, and definitely in the United States, promote the growth of the financial sector, embrace certain policies, and most importantly of which was keeping the inflationary pressures at bay. And this also meant that they would sometimes embrace austerity logic, which would then curb their sort of possibility to redistribute. And so there's a lot of work right now that shows us that financialization mattered in that sense for income inequality. My own work using cross-national data, over time data, has also shows that finance exerted upward pressure on income inequality in advanced countries during the past few decades.
What countries are you looking at? The
I've been
United
looking
States
at OECD nations,
Okay.
basically, yeah. And so yes, so we know that financialization mattered a lot for income inequality, but it's not all of it. It also mattered for the larger politics of inequality, and I think in that sense, we also have to pay a lot of attention to credit markets and households' increasing use of credit.
Okay, so is there a connection between income inequality and credit?
Absolutely.
Part
of my research has been trying to basically sort of explore that linkage. So let me step back and first of all say that I think it's one of the most important developments of the past few decades, households increasing use of credit. In the United States, credit has been a mainstay of American middle class life since the end of the Second World War, if not earlier. But even then, if you look at the past few decades, the role of credit in society has become more prominent. And the data shows us that income inequality and increasing credit use, they've been moving in tandem with each other in the United States. Now, increasing credit use is not necessarily an American story. It has been happening in other advanced nations as well.
To the extent that it's happening in this country?
It's very prominent in the United States, very prominent in the United Kingdom, and in the United States it was much higher compared to other European nations to begin with, but still it's much higher. But European nations have begun to catch up as well. There also there's a substantial increase. So in my work, what I'm trying to say is that credit matters a lot for inequality and for politics of inequality. It's a very powerful political tool, and the impact on inequality can be observed in several ways. First of all, credit allows individuals to consume a wide array of services and products that they may not be able to consume otherwise, right? If they stayed within their means.
Right.
This might affect the discontent. This might decrease the discontent that they might be having with their actual level of income and purchasing power. It affects the way people understand the structure of inequality in society and their place in it, right? So this is a really important thing. It blurs class differences. It makes it harder to infer, to distinguish, it makes it harder to infer who has and who has not, so to distinguish between the haves and have-nots of this world. So that's one really important impact of credit in terms of politics of inequality. But it also, credit use also, I believe, affected the ways in which governments began to respond to inequality. In the post-war era, governments routinely used tools of social policy to intervene and sort of to create, to deal with social risks and to generate economic prosperity.
Like what?
So social spending, right, to create jobs, when sort of to make transfer payments, when the gap between the rich and poor got too wide, to sort of narrow that gap. In the past few decades, what we see is retrenchment of government intervention in these areas. But at the same time, we see expansion of credit markets, right? In the past, governments, in order to be able to make intervention in these areas, they would spend. In order to spend, they would sometimes take on debt, right? Private, public, domestic, foreign. In the recent area, in the recent era, in the past few decades, we see citizens taking on debt, right, to enhance their lifestyles, to be able to buy that nice house, or simply to make ends meet. So what is happening is then sort of a shift from socialization of risk to privatization of risk. What we see is that as financial citizenship has taken hold, social citizenship has been undermined a little bit. So in two papers that I wrote, I found that credit access actually makes it possible for governments to sort of avoid the urgency of dealing with increasing income inequalities. And it also makes citizens in OECD nations to worry less about inequality and to be somewhat less supportive of redistributive policies.
But do you think that in terms of the population using the credit because they basically are not making enough money, it gets to a certain point where you're maxed out? So then do the governments then have to reevaluate what they've done?
This is a great question, and I thought I would come to that towards the end of our conversation. Absolutely, this is a very tricky politics because what credit does is it might fill that gap between your income and your consumption aspirations, right? So it might enhance your living standard today, but in the long run, it might actually make you very vulnerable to various macroeconomic shocks, right? It might heighten socioeconomic vulnerability. So in the context of the United States, this was sort of talked about as the hidden crisis of the American middle class. And it is a tricky politics, and yes, it's not sustainable, and if anything, one of the things that the 2008 economic crisis has shown us is that it's not sustainable, and governments have to be very careful in terms of who uses credit, with what terms, and so on and so forth.
Now, I know you're also very interested in what's going on in Turkey, so why don't you elaborate on what you're doing there in terms of how your research speaks to the political economy of Turkey.
Absolutely. So this year I'm a fellow at the Council for Middle East Studies at Yale, and I wrote a paper, it's actually coming out in a few weeks in the Middle East report, which is looking at the development of financial citizenship, credit markets, and sort of electoral politics in Turkey. So in Turkey also, during the past few decades, we saw a sort of a reformulation of the relationship between the state, banks, credit markets, and citizens. Until the 1980s, Turkey was very much a state-oriented economy with a sort of large public sector, some sort of a mixed economy. In the 1980s, economic liberalization policies started, and an important part of this economic liberalization policies was financial liberalization. In about 2 decades, the number of banks doubled. We saw a lot of new private banks. We saw foreign bank entry into the system. And many of these changes, however, very similar to other transition economies, happened very quickly and in the absence of a rigorous regulatory framework. So in the 1990s, the country was shaken by a series of economic crises.
Okay.
So the Justice and Development Party, led by Erdogan, came to power in 2002 after this sort of a decade-long economic turbulence and instability, right? And during the first term of the Justice and Development Party, and the second term as well, economic growth grew quite fast. And in this context of economic growth and rising consumption, credit use began to increase as well. It's important to understand that Turkish context is very different from the American context.
In what way?
Credit use was never had been a mainstay of middle class life. If families found themselves in hardships, they would go get money from their relatives, their kin. They would sometimes go to stores and purchase goods on installment credit.
Okay.
But credit markets, the way we see them, we understand them in the United States, they didn't really exist. Starting from the early 2000s, we see a substantial growth of credit use by Turkish households. And the mechanisms that I've been describing, they've been at play in the Turkish context as well. We saw sort of people experiencing a boost in their purchasing power, being able to consume a wide array of services and products. We saw, again, class boundaries getting blurred. So these are important in terms of politics of inequality, in terms of people's understanding of class. And these developments also cast the existing level of societal welfare in a very positive light. And I think in looking at the recent political developments of Turkey, it's important to identify this dimension as well. One of the major questions about Turkish politics recently has been, why has Justice and Development Party been so successful? Since 2002, the party has emerged victorious from every election, pretty much it has entered, right? And why is that the case? So there are several arguments about that, and one of them is, well, economic growth, right? Another argument is, well, social welfare provision. There have been some good things about that, especially in the healthcare area, but also development of certain informal networks, sort of basic goods provision through, sort of neighborhood communities and so on and so forth. But my argument in this paper is financialization, expansion of credit markets, and the sort of emergence of credit-based welfare is another factor that I think that has contributed to the success of this political party, and we have to talk about it. But again, just like you pointed out, this is a tricky politics, and Turkish households are, I think, becoming increasingly vulnerable, and this is something to think about.
Okay, so do you think is the inequality of income comparable to what it is in the United States?
Among OECD countries, inequality in Turkey, I think it's one of the highest income inequality countries in the OECD countries. I cannot remember from the top of my mind how it compares, but it's one of the highest income inequality countries within the OECD.
So what do you think moving forward potentially has will happen in terms of credit and the inequality of income?
So I think credit is a great tool, right? Expansion of credit was an important part of progressive agenda in the post-Second World War period in the United States, and there's good reasons for that, right? Enabling people to enjoy the products and services that the global economy has to offer, making people homeowners. These are all wonderful things. So I don't think it's about the product, but it's about the markets and the way those markets were sort of transformed, especially in the 2000s, that became somewhat problematic. And as I said, the 2008 economic crisis displayed those vulnerabilities in all their sort of really sort of nakedness, and there have been some attempts at reform, and so going forward, I'm somewhat optimistic.
Right. In Turkey, have they put more stringent controls on credit as they have done in this country after the 2008?
Yes. So very recently there have been some laws, and they are now beginning to address the issue of over-indebtedness.
Right, okay,
yes.
Very good. Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for
so
being
much
here.
for having me.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Kus and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.